So I made a slight mistake. We're here in Nanaimo. I've got two friends who visited me from Toronto, and we just headed across to Vancouver Island for a little bit of sightseeing and photography. And during the drive here, I decided to find a good spot we could shoot, and I loaded up the app to figure out exactly where the sun was going to set, and thought I had everything perfect. It looked like a perfect spot. It was even called Sunset Beach. But when I got here, I sort of had everything backwards, and I was a bit confused and figured out that I was not actually looking where the sun was setting, but rather where the sun was currently. So earlier in the afternoon, that worked out really well, but not so much now. So we've walked around the park and we're trying to find another spot, and we've just sort of got to these cliffs, which is near the actual Sunset Beach. But unfortunately, I'm not so sure we're gonna have a colorful sunset. It's really hard to tell. It looks like we might be able to catch some light, but right now it's looking quite dull. But two friends are already starting to get set up for their shots. I'm gonna walk around, see if I can find a photo opportunity. Might try and get a little bit lower, walk around and see if we can find a nice spot. So I just found this rock pool, which I had seen from up on the cliffs, and I thought it might be a really interesting sort of to use as my foreground. So I've just come down here and I'm gonna sort of look around, see if I can use my camera just to see if I can get sort of a nice composition that I like. So I'm just gonna set it up in live view, sort of just move my camera around by hand, no tripod yet, just see if I can sort of get an exact spot that I want. If I find something, it might be a little bit harder to get my tripod position just right, but that's all part of the process, just playing around with it. So I've got my camera set up in an interesting way. I can be a bit of a baby when it comes to salt water, and if I can avoid dunking my legs in salt and letting the water evaporate and then just be stuck with salt that can get in all the grooves, I'll avoid that. So I've got it all on some dry rocks here, and I think I can make that work. I'm gonna go with a vertical composition here just because I think it lets me include the rock pool as well as the cliff off in the background a little bit more. And there are some houses back there, and I'm anticipating that they'll turn on right around sunset as people return home and it gets darker outside. So it'll be really interesting to get this rock pool here surrounded by rocks and then have those lights come on in the background. There are some rocks on the right side that are perhaps a little bit sort of too intimidating. I think the rest of these rocks sort of flow together nicely through the scene as they lead out, but the rocks on the right side just really sort of build up and take over the scene, but I think I'll be able to work with it and try and still make something out of it. Now for this shot, we're shooting some pretty flat water. This water is not being agitated at all, but at the same time, this is a good instance where I do not want to use my polarizer. If I were to put the polarizer on and sort of remove some of this glare and reflection that's coming off of this rock pool, I'd sort of end up with a much darker water, and I'd be able to see mostly through it. And what it will kind of look like is a lack of any water here. So it's sort of like I'm just shooting some rocks, maybe some wet rocks. So having this rock pool, you can really sort of see the definition of the outlines of where the pool is. It just makes it a little bit easier. So definitely when you're shooting water, it doesn't mean you automatically always want to use a polarizer just to remove some reflections. Now I am doing a bit of focus stacking here just because I've got some rocks that are really close to my lens in the foreground. And I think for this one I'm actually going to stack 3 separate images. So I've got my rocks in the very foreground, then I've got some rocks off to the side, and then the cliff and the houses off in the distance. And so we've got sort of 3 distinct layers, and I think that they should be blended together pretty easily. Now I'm not doing any kind of long exposure here. I'm just letting my shutter speed sort of work itself out. Not too worried about shutter speed, but mainly what I do not want to smooth out the ocean off in the distance beyond the rocks, just because I think it's an interesting contrast between the rock pool here, which is sort of mirror still, and then you got a little bit of movement out in the ocean, so it makes it just a little bit more interesting that way. Now I did have a new little light I've been bringing with me, and I used that to light up the rocks in the foreground, and just shining my little light on illuminated them and created a little bit of shadow, so we've got some definition and some contrast in the rocks.